Hey guys, today I want to have a look at the negative efficacy argument and look at the New Zealand statistics. I'll cite my source of information in the description box below. Negative efficacy in terms of vaccination means that the vaccine makes you more likely to catch COVID or more likely to have severe symptoms or both. So to establish whether or not we're seeing negative efficacy, we first need to establish a baseline to measure against. So here we see the definition of a baseline in the context of research as follows. Data or information obtained prior to or at the onset of a study, e.g. before introduction of an intervention, so in this case the intervention would be the vaccine, that serves as a basis point for comparison with data collected at a later point in time so as to assess the effects of particular manipulations or treatments. Okay, so on this slide we have what we would see if there was no vaccine. So we have 100% of the population are unvaccinated, and 100% of new cases are unvaccinated, and 100% of hospitalisations are unvaccinated. So the unvaccinated would be represented in perfect proportion to the population, and this would be the only possible outcome. So this would be a 1x representation in both cases and hospitalisations. Pretty simple, but a 1x representation is not the baseline. Wish it was that simple. So let's go to the next slide. We recognise that the vaccine initially has a positive effect on hospitalisation rates. So let's be honest and acknowledge that this positive effect is there and is evident in the statistics, but the question is, once this protection wanes, does it leave your immune system back at baseline or worse? So let's get back to establishing the baseline. Looking back at my screenshot from February 8th and focusing on hospitalisations for now, we can see the positive impact of being vaccinated as is evident from the underrepresentation of the vaccinated in hospitalisations. On this chart, they are 77% of the population, but just 29% of new hospitalisations. So we divide 29 by 77 and see that this is a 0.37x representation, which is an underrepresentation. And remember, we're not arguing that the vaccine doesn't have a positive effect to start with, because it clearly does. So now let's look at the unvaccinated, which started at 1x. Now at 12% of the population and 43% of hospitalisations, this is a 3.6x representation. However, this can never be called negative efficacy because there is no medical intervention affecting the results. This is the baseline, and the baseline shifts. The representation of the unvaccinated is the baseline, and that's how we will measure positive and negative efficacy of vaccines. Staying above the baseline is effective, equal to the baseline would be ineffective, and below the baseline would be negative efficacy. And this makes perfect sense, as we would at worst expect the vaccinated to have an immune system equal to that of someone who never got vaccinated. So the vaccine does provide protection, we all know this. It's also accepted that the protection wanes and boosters are recommended, and none of this is in dispute. But what happens when someone doesn't get their second 2 shots? Do they fall back to baseline, or do they fall below baseline? These are today's rolling 7-day average numbers, and today is March 14th, 2022. We want to focus on those that got the first jab and never continued with the second 2 and compare it to the baseline, which, as we already confirmed, shifts. Baseline today is now 2.7x, and the single jabbed are 4x, which equals an overrepresentation of 1.48x of the baseline. So in simple terms, this suggests they now have an immune system that is weaker than those who never got vaccinated in the first place. Now let's have a look at a more general picture of vaccinated versus unvaccinated, and for this I'm grouping all levels of vaccination versus the unvaccinated. None of the vaccinated groups should have weakened immune systems, so I think it's fair to lump them in together for a trend analysis. So we can see that on February 8th, the vaccine seems to be working very well. Let's note that the single jabbed are not appearing in the hospitalisation statistics yet, but as we know, that changed as we would expect if the vaccine worked temporarily. So I have my calculations there, and the result is that the vaccinated were 0.1x of the baseline, which you all have to admit is impressive, or was impressive at the time. The question is, at what cost? Fast forward to today, and we have a very different picture. Feel free to pause this, I'm not going to go over all the math, but feel free to check me on it. The unvaccinated are now 0.34x of the baseline, which is a 240% decline in efficacy in just 5 weeks. So to summarise, 1. The vaccine has a positive impact on risk of hospitalisation that wanes quickly. 2. Those who did not follow through with the second and third shots are now overrepresented when compared to baseline hospitalisation rates. And 3, the overall hospitalisation rate of the unvaccinated is trending towards negative efficacy. And a disclaimer there, what has just been presented to you should be considered as evidence and not 100% proof. So while many will argue that despite this trend that the vaccine is doing its job, the question is at what cost? Do we want to keep vaccinating to keep our immune systems above baseline? And here's a bigger question. Is everyone who got vaccinated falling below the baseline for other illnesses? Because the vaccine is a COVID vaccine. It's not a vaccine against anything else. But if our immune systems are weakened, it's reasonable to ask if we're now less capable of fighting off all other illnesses. Did you trade a strong immune system for temporary protection against an illness that will soon be in the rearview mirror? I hope not, but it certainly looks that way. Cheers, guys.